welcome to another episode of FooBar. Today we are going to talk about EventBridge with James Beswick, AWS Serverless Developer Advocate. If you want to know more about cloud, serverless, or software engineer practices in general, subscribe in the red button below. I post 2 or 3 videos every week. So let's get started. So today is another episode in the series. This is not a podcast. I have interviewed many people. If you have not seen that series before, go and check it out. The link is here and also in the description box so you can watch it later. Today we have an amazing guest, James Beswick, developer advocate for serverless, and we are going to have a chat about EventBridge and how you can solve some problems and organize your architecture. So we go a lot in depth in different architectures and solving different problems, and we also see some demos on how EventBridge can help us. So let's go to the interview. Hello and welcome to another episode. Today I have a really amazing guest, James Beswick, developer advocate for serverless. So welcome, James, to this episode.
Hi Marcia, great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for accepting. And I don't know, can you share a little bit of what you do? What is your role? What you like?
Yeah. So I'm a developer advocate, which basically means I work for the serverless team and I help developers understand serverless products and get the benefits out of serverless. So it's pretty cool as a job because I get to talk to developers all the time, produce lots of proof of concept applications and ideas, but also when people give me ideas and features I'd like to see, I get them to go back to the product team so we can build things that people want. So it's a perfect job for me, really. I like it a lot.
Yeah, that's nice. And you've been in AWS more or less the same as I had been, like a year or something.
Yeah, I think you and I joined just about the same time. So it's been 1 year in AWS, and I've worked with serverless generally for about 3 years. So I think that that's kind of basically as long as anybody, probably.
Yeah. It's quite an early adopter, as we will say.
Yeah, and I got into it totally by accident because basically I was working on a range of different products built on EC2 and Elastic Beanstalk. And we just had lots of maintenance problems because we had so many different products and services were built for customers. And so I went to Serverless Conf and discovered serverless. And it was really funny because originally I thought it was just about imagery sizing or something. And then after this weekend at Serverless Conf, I had this epiphany about what we could build.
Were this one in New York?
I ended up spending a lot of... It was in New York, yeah.
Yeah, the first one.
I was working with all these different developer teams. Yeah. And it was actually amazing because they had all these workshops and things. So it's quite incredible what they put together.
Yeah.
But so I really enjoyed it a lot. And then I got to talk to a lot of developer groups about how they should implement it. And we found out lots of the sort of patterns and things that weren't really widely discussed. And as a result, we sort of stumbled into it. But I enjoyed the part where I got to talk to developers. So then AWS approached me and said, hey, you could do this as a DA. And I thought, okay.
Sounds good. Yeah, I love those serverless conferences as well when they were running. I think that they were the beginning of the serverless community that is pretty amazing nowadays. And I think now we have serverless days to kind of continue the story of the serverless conferences. But
serverless days is really picked up in an incredible way. And what I love about this community is just look at it. There's so many people who are incredibly smart and give their time very generously at these conferences. And as a developer, you can go and meet them and talk to them and they'll answer your questions. And there aren't that many types of IT area where that's true. I mean, you couldn't do that in lots of spaces, but in serverless, you can meet some of the smartest minds in this space and go to an event for $50 and have your questions answered, and they'll help you on Twitter and be on Twitch and everything else. So it's a fantastic time to be in serverless.
It is, and I think, at least for me, this community was one of the reasons why I could learn and develop so much, because there was so many people that were willing to answer my questions and help me out and have interesting chats without really judging me that I had no experience on building serverless applications, because nobody had any experience on building serverless.
No, and one of the things I'm sure you find too is that a lot of people outside of AWS think that we know everything.
Oh no.
And we definitely don't know everything. So being able to have this community where there are questions that come up, and I can turn around to the Ben Keyhoes and the Jeremy Dailies of this world and sort of ask my question is just really helpful.
Yeah, and those group guys and like influencers have so many good feedback as well because they're power users. So it's always nice to hear what they have to say, and then we can. Oh, that sounds interesting. That's an interesting use case. Have not thought about that, but well, thank you.
Yeah, and it's amazing also the last couple of years just to see how that community is growing because for a long time you saw the same sort of people over and over who were early adopters. But in the last year or so, you've really started to see more people come into the space. And now I meet people who I met a year ago who were in my position. Like they knew nothing about serverless. And now they're talking about things that are really cool that they've built. So I can see the whole thing expanding very, very quickly.
Yeah, and I think that's also because of this type of conference like Serverless Days and all the meetups and all the different community events that are being organized around this topic that are quite cool and I think bring people into the area and I don't know, I love this community. I think from all the communities I've been part of, this is my favorite.
Yeah, and actually since we're doing all these virtual meetups, that's been great too to meet people in other geographies because I did a meetup for Brazil a couple of weeks ago. And obviously that's an area that is starting to use serverless very rapidly and a huge number of people showed up at this meetup. So the fact we can do these remote meetups with people means we can talk to people all over the world really easily. So I hope even as things go back to normal that we can keep doing the remote stuff.
At least my YouTube channel is really strong in India and Latin America. I think maybe Latin America because I'm Latino and that helps, but it's not like this type of events. Maybe I go as a developer advocate, I move around Europe, but for me it's something I really love from the online events and online communities that I can talk with people all around the world and I might never meet them in person or maybe I will, but I can have discussions and I can help out people and others can help me as well through the internet. And I think I hope that's the only thing we keep from this craziness, that we keep the online large communities that we have been building during this time, because I think that's something that is good and it benefits everybody. And in a lot of developing countries, they may be adopting cloud for the first time, and they skip all the instances and virtualization and they jump directly to serverless. So why to go through all these old things then, and if we can just go directly to the coolest and newest. So there is a lot of opportunity.
And it's also a great time for people starting to build this way because you don't basically need anything apart from a laptop and an internet connection.
Exactly.
And even with the EC2 based stuff, it was fairly easy. But with serverless, it's very easy. I mean, really, you can start building in a matter of minutes. And so, I think back to when I first started building things, where you needed to go and buy servers and talk to people to get money to go and rack boxes for you and things. It could often take months to get started. Whereas now, if you have an idea, really, I've seen hackathons and things where people can build something that's fairly complicated in just a single day.
Yeah, and I think that's the magic of serverless as a, set of managed services, not only Lambda, but like everything that is serverless that you can just put together with a little bit of glue here and there and build quite amazing things. As we were talking before about Amplify in our chat before getting started. For me, that's one example of a service that glues so many of these serverless components together, Lambda plus other services like Dynamo, AppSync, API Gateway, all in a simple way that you can get shipped super fast. So I think it's this type of things help a lot of people to get in started. But the topic of today is about EventBridge, and maybe it can help developers as well, but I think it's more targeted to organizations and like how organizations can adopt serverless in a way.
EventBridge is a really interesting service, not because of what it is, because actually what it is fairly simple, but more about what it can do for you. And I think about when I worked for enterprises before and the sort of difficulty you have in building software, they tend to be fairly intangible problems. You're building things where there's a lot of legacy stuff or existing systems you have to integrate with, or you've got other systems that are not part of your core cloud that you have to reach out to, so like Stripe or Datadog or Auth0, that kind of thing. And somehow when you build these systems, they all have to click together. And so, I think for a long time we got into this mess where we produce very long convoluted code to try and, get this piece of information, wait for this, do this in parallel. And in fact, the EventBridge approach using an event bus can be very freeing if you're in that kind of environment.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe where we can start our discussions on the challenges of building serverless architectures, because I think that's one of the discussions that you can start building a hello world pretty fast on serverless. As you said, you don't need much, and it's true. But then if you want to implement a serverless, a new service in your existing organization, or you want to get started with serverless, it's not super easy. Right. It can be easy, but you need to learn the new way. So what do you say that are the biggest challenges to get started?
So I think for building these larger types of applications, there are a couple of different things at play. You've got the first one where, because serverless is like Lego, where you've got services you're assembling and you're gluing together with Lambda, and you can build these fairly elaborate structures. Once they go beyond a certain size, if you're not careful, you can end up with very monolithic code bases where suddenly you've got one repo with all this stuff going on. And you kind of know when you get there as well, when you start to get to a certain size, that actually it's got a little bit unwieldy. And so that's a good time to start thinking about how to slice things up a little bit more.
Yeah, when you get to your CloudFormation limits, that's a good sign.
Yeah. And ultimately, a lot of this stuff, you forget you're deploying infrastructure. So although it takes a few minutes to deploy, what you're doing is very fast, really. But once you're doing it very frequently, it can start to feel like it's not as fast as it could be.
Exactly.
So I found when using this event-based approach, because you can break it down to these smaller services where there's less infrastructure and fewer functions that you're deploying each time just for that one service, it helps get that speed back just in terms of the throughput of getting code into production. But I think also the second thing that people often forget is in enterprises and even in startups, when you're building software, you don't actually know how the software is going to change in the future. Oh. Your requirements are always incomplete, and you think you know what everything's going to be when you've got them today, but a week from now, requirements change, users need something else. And so you really need to be able to build something that's very nimble, where you can then pivot and do things you've not thought about planning on. And I think this is something that can really help with that if you get into a good microservice design.
Yeah, and I think, at least for me, the challenges for serverless architectures are the challenges of distributed systems itself, and I think it exposed a lot of those things that maybe we're so used to having these boxes that now, because we can do virtualization, that could be fat and big, and we were very lazy on how to create our applications. And now we are exposed to all these bare bones of the distributed systems on how you can manage microservices for real and not to have these little monoliths that they were doing a lot of things. Because I think a lot of people say, we have a microservice architecture. And then when you start looking, the microservice, if they need to rewrite it, it will take 2 or 3 years to rewrite that microservice. Is that a microservice? What is your definition for it? How micro is your microservice? And I think that's a question that a lot of people don't know how to answer.
Yeah. A lot of the time, there's the organizational elements and the people elements are important in this, because, the sort of Conway's law concept where it's what size should your microservice be is really something that's more about your organization and your particular needs. But I do think, in any case, you want to make sure that you're scoping all these things to a size where you can remain agile and keep being nimble.
Yeah. And there is this author, Sam Newman, that says that the nice size for a microservice is that you can rebuild it in 2 weeks. And I kind of like that concept. Maybe 2 weeks is too short for your organization, but I've been using that concept a lot for when building my Lambda microservices, in the sense of, and also in previous life when I was building microservices in Java, how long it will take to rewrite this stuff. It will take me 3 years, or I can just replace it. Because when you can replace it, then, as you say, you can build things that can change very fast, or they can be replaced with parts of the cloud provider. I remember when I got started with serverless, we were building something that was step functions in our application. And then in the middle of the development, step functions were launched. And because we were using this concept, it was so easy for us to throw whatever we were building and integrate the real step functions into it. And that reduced the cost of ownership and a lot of headaches.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it's about reducing the amount of code that you produce because, fundamentally, I strongly believe in the idea that code is a liability, like especially my code. And so if I can offload that somewhere else, step function is one of those services that I think people underuse. And if you can use that in your workflows and you can rip out all of this code you've got where it's basically doing this error handling and retry logic and all these things that's very generic, you get down to a very streamlined code base. It's much, much easier to deploy and make changes to. And I think those things are becoming the really important aspects of software design these days.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's very hard for developers to think that writing code is not the thing that produces the most value because you think, I think a lot of developers think that their main value producing is code as an output. You drink coffee and you produce code, and that's not true. I think developers, they create systems and they build applications, and even if you glue them together with just as little code as possible, that's also work that is worth, and it's not about doing the more work, but it's being the smartest.
And also, I think, I've been around this whole thing for long enough now. I've been coding one way or another for most of my life. And the thing that people always forget is that when you go back to something you wrote 6 months ago, you can never remember why you wrote it that way.
No.
And it's, when you have things that are shorter and just simpler to read, and they integrate with services, you can look at that code much more easily and assess what it's doing and why you did that.
Yeah, and it's easier to write tests.
Or some of the things I wrote are really embarrassed. Yeah.
And more if you're focusing on your business logic, it's easier to think about, for example, unit tests when you're thinking about business logic. But when you're thinking about a network integrator of things, how I write tests for this thing, because it's not your expertise. It's just sometimes very confusing. So I don't know. I think that the main concept of serverless is not reinventing the wheel.
Yeah. But I do think, when you think about distributed systems, in the old world, this is kind of hard. I mean, you have to understand a lot of things to make it work. Whereas in the new space in serverless, I think the way the abstractions work is actually much more acceptable to people. It's easy to pick up a queue and play with it, or you need to understand how errors and retry logic work. It's actually much simpler in many respects because of the networking and other stuff is handled for you.
Exactly, and I think that's the key differentiator. And I think EventBridge is a great example because when you look at EventBuses in legacy systems, you think that's a bottleneck. We don't want to have a place that collects all the events for our organization. It's very hard to scale, it's very hard to manage, and we don't want to do that. And I think that's the reason why EventBuses stopped being popular, because if you have to manage it yourself, they're a pain to manage that. But now if we go to the cloud, and the cloud is the one saying, hey, I manage this for you, just put your events here. And then it's a totally different story because you get the benefits of having a managed service and the benefits of having an event bus. And that applies to everything in the serverless world.
Yeah, actually that's two really important benefits I think you get with EventBridge that do solve those problems of the past, because that single point of failure question in the past, having a highly available elastic service like EventBridge, EventBridge currently processes trillions of events per month, so the scale is just vast. It solves that single point of failure problem. But the second problem I remember from when we did some event work in the past was that when you start to have all these different services producing events everywhere, it can be hard to keep track of the formats and the schemas of what's going on. So having the schema registry component where it automatically discovers that and manages that for you actually saves a lot of the headache there as well.
Yeah, that's something really nice that was added in re:Invent this year, and I love it because when you're working in a teams, like you have everybody's working on the microservice, and then you need to communicate with them, And communication is good, but if you have a big company distributed around the countries, then it's hard. You need to agree on the format, and maybe when they're implementing it, they change it, and there's so many things that or you need to keep documentation up, and we know developers are not that good at writing documentation. So having a place that can read the events and tell you this is the format is the best way. It just solves all the communication issues.
Yeah, and it's very simple to use as well. I mean, I think a lot of these services, it can be daunting when you first pick up a new service and learn how to use it. At the end of the day, this is just JSON. Yeah. I mean, really, you're passing just JSON around and pushing it into a bus, receiving it from a bus. And there's nothing really that complicated you need to understand about how the bus mechanics work. You just trust the fact that the messages will get there.
Yeah, and the cool thing is that you can send also events through different AWS accounts, so you don't need to limit, like if you have a very big system or cross-account or like different environments, and you can do very, very creative things with this service. It's very flexible, and that's something I've been enjoying seeing people doing all crazy things.
Yeah, and actually, I don't think we talk about this nearly enough, but most larger organizations have lots of accounts.
Exactly.
It's not. I think people think when it comes to this new that it's always just one account all the time, but we work with companies that have thousands of accounts.
Yeah.
And so having these services where you can move things from account to account is really important.
And in big companies, it happens that every microservice might be inside one account. So if you want your services to communicate to each other, maybe before thinking about EventBridge, they were using API Gateway. So they were going to the internet, doing a call and making a REST call. And I don't know if that's the most efficient way, because it's a lot of overhead for just making your two services talk to each other. Yeah. They should be fine by just sending an event. So if you can just send a cross-account event, it's so simple.
Yeah. In fact, that's a really good use case for it, because when you look at using API Gateway in this way, where you have either a webhook set up or you're using polling or some sort of mechanism to get these two services speaking, you've got events going over the internet. So there you've got an endpoint you've got to secure and think about. Exactly. It's another piece of infrastructure you have to manage and care about and feed and water. And some of these services can really send you a lot of traffic. So you have to be able to scale up and down appropriately as well. So using this, you simply get rid of all of that, because those services, like the Auth Zeros and Datadogs and PagerDuty services, just put the events on their bus in their AWS account, and they pop up in your bus in your account. And you don't actually have to think about any of the other stuff about how that works.
Exactly, and I think that's going again back to the idea of not reinventing the wheel. Let the cloud provider take care of it. You just take care of your events, and then you do something with it. And I think it's so nice that there's so many SaaS providers integrating with EventBridge, because that's something that makes the life easier. But I think we should go back to the point on why to use EventBuses instead of API gateways, queues, or webhooks, because I think that's a very important thing to mention. So why do you think we should not use them?
So I think, webhooks are an improvement over polling, obviously. But polling is like the traditional way of doing this. You ping an API endpoint, do I have more information? Do I have more information? And you've got this problem of it's very compute intensive. It's very wasteful. Most calls come back with nothing.
Exactly.
And you've got a lag, and if you're polling every minute and you have distributed events randomly, you average 30-second wait time to know when there's new information. So there's a lot of bad things in polling, but it's worked for a long time. But then webhooks came along, and that was a massive improvement. You get much more closer to real time where they call you. But not every service supports this. This is still something that's rare in some cases.
And you need to integrate specifically to that, because that's a big problem. So for example, just put in an example of, this food delivery, that they might have million restaurants. Do they do a webhook against each of the restaurants, or do the restaurants do a webhook against each of these delivery providers? It's just so complicated.
And it's the management of these things starts to become really problematic. And when you look at these designs, it comes back to this really the conceptual idea of command-oriented versus observed. that, fundamentally, when you go to this event model, all your service has to do is say what it sees. An order arrived, a customer did this, a payment process. And then how that event is consumed, whether it's consumed by one service or 1,000, is not actually anything you worry about. You've created the event, and now it's not your problem.
Exactly, and I think that's amazing.
So I think conceptually that's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's hard sometimes for people that maybe coming from a more traditional to think about just saying, hey, I created a new customer. What needs to happen now? Maybe the notification comes and take that event and does something, and maybe the orders come and does something, and maybe marketing does something. But you don't care, and that's very scalable, because then a new service comes in and the only thing they need to do is listen to that event. So you don't need to worry about registering to everybody, every service that is new that needs to talk to each other. And I think that's the biggest problem when you're using these one-to-one connections, kind of.
Yeah. Well, certainly with APIs, you're always thinking about, the piece of information or the structure of the call all the time in a very precise, tightly coupled way. Whereas with events, often you can build things where you might be publishing events that no one's listening to yet. And you might overpublish. You might put more information out there about events that maybe are never of interest to anybody, but you simply don't know at this point. And it creates much more flexibility that people downstream can go, oh, I didn't know that piece of information was available. And they can build software based upon useful events that you have no idea about and you're not on the hook to maintain.
Yeah, and that's the nice thing again of the registry. If you have a place where all these things are logged, people can come and look, oh, all this information is available. Why nobody's using it for anything?
Yeah. So I think this comes part of this, you become more of the community of developers within your company when you do this. You can create something that's more, helpful, because I often see when you have these calling services setups, when you build a successful service, your team, building these features, it's great. And then as more people integrate with you, you get slower and slower and slower because you have to do all the work to be able to integrate downstream with the API. And you end up putting people on a queue where they have to wait some period of time to integrate. And then all your team is basically doing is integration work, and you stop being agile completely. And so I've seen this happen many, many times. And so the model of just putting an event bus in the middle may not be immediately obvious, the benefits that, because when you first couple it up, you may only have a couple of consumers. Yeah. But over time, as your successful service gets more and more consumers, that's really where the benefit lies, because you're not having to deal with the integration piece.
Exactly. And I think that's super important, and you can see it, as you said, not right away, and that's something people might not realize. Like, when you think of the use case, it's like A to B. Why to put this layer in the middle? But usually things change. One thing I was thinking is about the events construction, because there is this kind of like different ways of making the events, and if you can make an event that is fully loaded with information that has everything, like I created a customer and then you put all the information you need. Or then there are events that are more minimal and they say I created a customer with this ID. And I think that's something also very important to understand when you're designing an event-driven architecture. What type of event is good for the right moment?
Yeah, and I think this is a great subject because it's complicated and it varies depending on the application.
No right answer.
Yeah, I mean, if I try to come up with some sort of guidelines, I guess. Generally, it's useful if you get everything in an event you can use without having to do more lookups. If you send me just a customer ID and I have to go away and then look up everything to go and do my job, that's not as good as an event as it could. But at the same time, you don't necessarily want to get a phone book of information if it's just all superfluous. So there's definitely a balance there.
And also the information in the event might need to be on sync, and if you read an old event, and I think that's why there is no right answer, because it depends on your needs, that you might want to get the whole thing, or you might just want to get something. If you need, I don't know, the transactions for the customer, maybe you don't want to send all the transactions in the event. You might just send the ID, and then whatever microservice might go and might need to ping the service. But I think that's important in order also to understand if you are emitting an event, you don't know who is listening, and then they might come back to you and bombard you with queries if you leave your events to like not complete.
Yeah.
So
I think, I was looking at some of the AWS events when they go through schema registry and pull in loads of those, and a lot of those are very well thought out, because initially you can look at it and go, wow, that's a lot of information. But the way they're designed is that the structure of the whole object doesn't have to change frequently. Often you'll see arrays used when you'll only ever get one object, but it's future-proofing in case it changes. And the way the categorization in the event works is often smartly thought out, so if they need to add attributes, it won't cause problems downstream. So definitely, if you're brand new to this, looking at some of the S3 events or AWS events can be a good guideline to, do you need timestamps? Do you need transaction IDs? Do you need all these things? And they can help influence how you might design your event.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point that you mentioned, the backwards compatibility. Because if you keep on building new events all the time with different format, everything will break. So people might hate to use your events because everything changed. But how to handle the changes, I think that's a very interesting thing that people need to think about when they're designing the events, how they add the new attributes. Because for sure your system will change and you will have new things to add in your events, but how you handle that. And as a consumer also, I think it's very important for the resiliency of your application to handle the events properly.
And ultimately there is this sort of event contract that exists. Once you start publishing events, you are basically ethically bound as a good developer, not just change your event arbitrarily. So I think much like API contracts, you have to think about how you're going to version those and roll out changes. But much of what you learn in APIs, I think you can use in events as well.
Exactly. And I think it applies the same kind of rules that you don't want to break. But with APIs, people think, I make a new version of the API. So then you have APIs that have 27 million versions or 3.1.2.3. And that's how they add things to their... that's something I don't like from APIs, because I think it's very confusing to document all this versioning. So
well, certainly with events, I err on the side of providing too much information, because from my point of view, my cost doesn't change. You're paying $1 per million events put onto the bus, and you've got that size limit of an event which you can go up to, but adding a few more attributes isn't going to slow it down or cost
how it
you
works
money.
In AWS, I think for inside your applications, how much it costs. I think it's free to send events between your applications.
If you use the put events method, that's where you incur costs. So it's free to consume from AWS services, but anytime your custom applications put things on the bus, that's when you incur a fee. But you don't get charged for receiving anything. So if you have a service that puts one event on the bus and it's being received by 10,000 services, you're only being charged for one event.
Nice. So then don't worry, just put all the information.
Yes, put it in there.
And you're charged per event, so if your event is fat, it's okay.
Yeah, exactly.
That's interesting. And I think also one thing that we should cover about is how choreography is one way that people refer to event-based architectures. Are the same or are different, or what is
definitely different? Yeah, and this is another tough conversation because we all inherently know what it is. But if you think about the e-commerce example as being a good one, where you place an order on the website and there's a payment that happens, and then someone reserves the inventory, and then they go and figure out how to put in the box and get a shipping label and get it to you. There's all these different flows that happen. And just as a flow chart, you cannot take the payment until you reserve the inventory, and you cannot ship the product until you've taken the payment. So there's all these dependencies along there as well. And I think that sort of flow is not really what you want to use an event-based architecture for, because you'll end up writing a lot of extra code to make sure things have happened. This is really where step functions is a good tool for this. But those sort of flows, they look complicated, but they get to be incredibly hard when you have to deal with error logic. So you have problems where, a payment fails, or the product wasn't in the warehouse that you thought it was, or the shipping's been lost, or something's happened. And modeling how you then back out all those stages is much, much easier in step functions than it would be in any other sort of system.
So transactions basically are maybe not a good fit for these event-based architectures.
Yeah, I think where you have this sort of sequence of things that happen and the complex workflows that you'd whiteboard in a flowchart. This is kind of, as soon as I see a flowchart, my immediate go-to is like, that's a step functions task right there.
Exactly. And I think that there is no right answer. I think there are these two or as many different architectures, and you should use them in the right way.
Yeah. And I think you kind of know this when you build these events where if you've built a system where you've got multiple applications listening to events, but an event goes from service 1 to service 2 to service 3, you're starting to see something that's more like orchestration.
Yeah.
Whereas events to me are really more about this integration across services that probably your team doesn't control and you don't know who's consuming them. And so it's a slightly different use case. Yeah. But having said that, if you have a really simple example where you've just got two services that are chatting to each other, there's almost no wrong way to do it. You could use whatever you like in that case. It's when it gets more elaborate it's worth thinking
about. I think the e-commerce is a great example because people might start a process and the process of buying something has so many steps that if something goes wrong, then you need to revert all the steps. Like, for example, I don't know, you're buying something, you have to validate it with the credit card. Okay, now the credit card is valid. Then you need to maybe send it to ship or to get it fulfilled first. And maybe if the stock of that item is not valid, do you want to revert? Then you need to revert your credit card. You need to write all this logic somewhere on how to revert each transaction. And doing that with events, it's very painful.
That can get really kind of unwieldy. And like the day I understood the power of step functions was the day we'd built some complex workflow like this, and then it changed. We had the version 2 of the workflow where suddenly there was all this other stuff going on. And because of the way step functions can manage multiple workflows in flight, and you've got this long-lived fact, workflow can go for up to a year. I built this second workflow and we put it in place and everything worked. And that was my big epiphany when I realized just how useful that particular service was.
It is, and I think that's it's an important point that you don't need to use everything needs to be event based and not everything needs to be a step function. Just use it in the right in the right place, and I think transactional things that are kind of a thing that needs to go in choreography or somewhere. Also to know the state, because it's something you might need to know the state of the whole transaction. With event-driven architectures, there is no state. Nobody knows what is the nobody controls anything. So you cannot ask what is the status of this order.
No, events really, when you think about them, they have these unique characteristics that once you get your arms around, become a bit clearer. There's this temporal element of it, the point in time really matters, and then it's really just a set of facts about something that happened, and maybe a little bit of state, but mostly it's just a fact. A customer placed an order.
Exactly.
This alarm went off. This thing happened, and so that definitely. There's some interesting attributes there. If you have a system that's collecting lots of events and a downstream service goes down, when your system comes back up, you can actually replay all those events. And that's actually pretty amazing because it's really just a simple way of coming back up. And you couldn't do that very easily with other systems. But definitely events have characteristics that are unique to what they do.
Yeah, and I think the capability of replaying your events, that's something that is so easy to do with EventBridge. You can just save all your events and then you can put them in another AWS account and you can try what your production system are doing, for example. And I don't know, you can do so many crazy things that you cannot do any other way. I really like that.
And the thing I've started to play with more and more is that these systems are not all totally separate. You can actually mix and match them as you want to. So you can use SQS with EventBridge. You can use EventBridge behind API Gateway if you want to build a really resilient webhook that way. You can use SNS with EventBridge if you need to fan out to large numbers of consumers. And you can plug all these things together. And they're really not expensive to use, and the amount of latency you introduce is not usually, it's very significant. So it's easy to experiment and see which combinations can work really well for your applications.
Yeah, because EventBridge combines with so many AWS services, so it's something that is not just EventBridge Lambda.
Right.
It can be, you can build anything, even no Lambda.
Yes, that's another thing we're starting to see more and more of. And Eric Johnson, my colleague, built a rel shortener that uses just VTL and API gateway, and you've seen people start to put together these things where if you can just get data from one service to another and you're not doing anything particularly complicated, you don't need Lambda in the middle.
No.
And nothing's cheaper than no Lambda.
Exactly.
So no
and
code is fantastic.
VTL is a really powerful language. It's just people don't know how to use it. Sure, you need to learn something new, but after you start getting the grasp of it, it becomes very powerful. I learned it when I was using the AppSync, and the resolvers of AppSync towards the different data sources are built with VTL. And at the beginning I was just invoking Lambda, and then calling Dynamo, for example. And I realized that that's so stupid, because the things I was doing with Lambda, they were so simple. I was maybe doing some filtering or some validation or something, and I can do exactly the same with VTL, and I will avoid latency, and I will avoid errors, and I will avoid one layer completely, and Dynamo and AppSync can talk to each other.
Yeah.
So,
and I think this is part of the evolution of how we think about serverless, because for a long time people thought Lambda is serverless. Like
exactly.
that's the whole universe of serverless right there. But Lambda is just the compute piece. And when you think about these other services that are also serverless, and when we say serverless, really we're saying they're managed services. If you can integrate those together, then great. The classic one we've seen for a long time is CloudFormation and S3.
Yeah.
That's a serverless combination.
Yeah, I always say that serverless S3 is the best example of serverless service. And if you think about it, it's been out since the cloud has been out. It was one of the first services. So it's like SQS and S3 are the first services out in the cloud, and they are the two more serverless services that are out there. So serverless is a concept that we are used to, and it's just that it got marketing name now, but it's cloud.
Yeah.
Maybe it's cloud 2.0 in the sense that we are not using instances, but we are taking the benefits of the cloud, of somebody managing all these things for us. We are paying for what we use. We don't need to manage infrastructure. And at the end of the day, the idea of having a cloud provider is not to manage infrastructure.
Yeah.
It started with instances, but now it goes more abstract and more abstract.
Yeah. I think, because a lot of people ask me, is this serverless? Is this serverless? I think it's a useful term as a concept. But really what we're talking about is this idea that we're becoming more outcomes focused.
Yeah.
That as developers, our job is to solve problems and think about outcomes. And that takes away, if you're thinking about running sudo yum update on your operating system, is that really useful to you? Is that actually going to help you with your outcome? And so being able to use these services that get you faster to what you want to build is really what serverless is about.
Definitely, and again we go back to the definition of serverless, that is not reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I think there is a fancier way to say it, but I like to say it like that.
Yeah, and a lot of this is just a matter of, when you've got cloud providers building these tools that are very, very scalable and very, very resilient, you're getting access to these and using them very easily through the infrastructure as code. The cost is usually much, much cheaper than you could do something yourself on premise with your own teams. And so it's really just a way of leveraging things that have been built. And so again, the Lego brick concept I really like, because you wouldn't want to build your Millennium Falcon by building your own Lego bricks, but you can just get your bucket of bricks and build it really easily. And so I think that's the analogy I use when I think about building serverless applications.
Definitely, and I think that's sometimes is again back to what the developer should be doing. What is the role of a developer? If building, just producing code without thoughts, or really producing value and creating systems that are kind of making your stakeholders happy, and usually stakeholders, customers, or whoever is paying your salary doesn't care if you run in an instance or you run in a Lambda, or if you're not using Lambda whatsoever, while you're just delivering the value that they expect and you're fast.
Yeah.
Everybody's happy.
Very true.
So I think that's something that it takes a time to get back to the culture of, we don't need to own everything. We don't need to be able to SSH in all the machines. Everything is secure. Everything is fine. Don't worry.
I mean, personally, I find it a big relief because, in my previous role, we built a lot of web and mobile apps for customers, and there's a lot of complexity in rolling these things out to devices all over the world at large scale. And so being able to lean on other people's services that are resilient to do the work for you, I find takes a lot of stress out of the job, because doing it from scratch would be very difficult.
Exactly, and I have been building for scratch for example, I don't know why I end up building authorization services like Cognito, but from scratch, and it's always the same. Maybe that's why I built 4, because I built the first one, then the next company hired me. Oh, you have experience in that. And then I built the third one because I have it, and it's exactly the same. No value added. It's just, maybe they have a different validation somewhere here and there, but it's so small.
Right.
It's just like, why? Why you pay someone to do that for 6 months?
Yeah, and when you think about services like Auth0, which you can just drop into your app with a dozen lines of code, and they've got these great tutorials. So in 30 minutes you can go from knowing nothing to having a fully working auth system. And I mean, I think that's got to be the way to go. The downside risk of building an auth system yourself is huge. It's better to leave it to companies that can build these things really reliably.
Exactly. So for me, it's about leveraging that. They have the expertise. I just have the need. I use it, and then I build what I'm expert on. I don't know, whatever is my company building. Let's build that. Let's spend time working on features the customers want, and just forget about the rest of the thing.
Exactly.
But maybe we can talk a little bit more about EventBridge and show a demo that I know you want to show us. What exactly is EventBridge in the AWS words? Because we talk a lot about it, but maybe we never define it.
Yeah. So EventBridge is a serverless event bus, and it evolved from Cloudwatch events. So a Cloudwatch events is a service that's been around for years, and really processes trillions of events per month. The difference between the two, because this has evolved and gained new functionality, is EventBridge can also take events from SaaS providers, and it treats events as really first-class citizens throughout your entire infrastructure. So in the demo, I've been writing a lot of stuff about EventBridge, and really the key thing is that because it stands between services and different applications, it becomes this layer where you can separate things out. And so you get past the fact that an event is just JSON, and really once an event comes into an event bus, you have a rule that tells it can go somewhere if it contains this attribute or this value, will get routed to different targets. Really, it's just a router for events.
Yeah.
And you don't ever have to think about scaling it or shards or anything like that. You can throw one event or millions of events. It just keeps working. But I think in terms of what I've been showing people, it's more about how to take it and put it in between services and introduce that, and what's the benefit of doing that? Why does that help? So the demo I have for you is one where if you build serverless applications, you might well have done the S3 to Lambda integration.
Yes.
Where you have to then deploy using SAM, and you have to create your own S3 bucket. Well, in an enterprise situation, often that's not going to work for you because the S3 bucket already exists.
Exactly.
Or you may want a Lambda function that listens to lots of S3 buckets. Or maybe you have one bucket that needs to invoke 100 different Lambda functions. Or maybe you want to create an application where the bucket doesn't exist yet, like it's a dynamic name where you have accounts January, accounts February, and you just know you need to listen to buckets that begin with the word accounts.
Yeah.
So this is really this more dynamic and complex use case that I think is more reflective of what you would see in an enterprise environment.
Yeah, and I don't like the idea of having to create the S3 bucket and you don't know what you get when you are, because it's not realistic. So I think starting from there to the rest, it helps everybody to just decouple those two things together.
Yeah, yeah. And it also means, again, you have this flexibility of just, you don't have to then build the buckets as part of your deployment, and you separate out the infrastructure piece that doesn't really change at all from from your piece that you want to better manage. So I think it's a good pattern.
It is, definitely, because I think S3 buckets are those things that you don't want to deploy every time you deploy a new, a new part of your application. It's like, well, why? Why don't you have it there?
But it's actually very simple, so I can show you how this works.
Show us.
Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, so I'm in the Cloud9 instance here, which is great just for running small projects and things. It runs on an EC2 instance, but that's the only EC2 instance I have. So what I've done is all of my code examples come from this GitHub repo with my Twitter handle on it, JBESW. And I've just finished a series of blog posts that are all part of this same theme called S3 to Lambda. So I'll just clone this repo. And it's a bit small on the left, but we don't need to see the left too much. So
yeah, the cool thing of Cloud9 that it comes with SAM and everything already. So the only thing you need to do is configure your GitHub with your GitHub credentials, and then you can start cloning things.
Exactly. So what I'll do is I'll deploy one of these, and while it's deploying, I'll talk through the example. So we just do SAM build, and then do SAM deploy using the new guided approach, which I love.
Yes, we're missing that.
And I'll just call this JBasic last year S3.
Always good namings.
I have a lot of buckets, so. Sure. And that's now going to deploy. So while that deploys, so there's 4 examples in here. I'll go through a couple of them. The first one is pretty straightforward. So this is a SAM template, and it looks more complicated than it is. So this is simply going to show how we connect an S3 bucket with a Lambda function. And so the parameters are just allowing you to enter bucket names, so you don't need to worry about those too much. And in the resources, it has a source bucket, which we're going to create in this case, but we don't actually have to do that. And then there's a logging bucket, because we have to use CloudTrail to integrate the 2 services. So further down, you can see here, this is the most complex piece of the whole document. It's basically
policies.
Policy. Yeah. So this is the part you want to cut and paste if you want to copy this example. This is the best part. So all of that is simply policies, letting CloudTrail do the logging. And then a bit further down, you have a little bit more configuration for CloudTrail. Basically, the event selectors are key to make sure you don't log too much. You only need to get a little bit of logging information to make this work.
So what CloudTrail is doing in this example?
So in this case, what happens is it's simply pulling objects that are put into the bucket. So I'm just caring in this case for put objects. But there's a lot of different S3 events you can listen to. You can listen to everything from people listing objects in the bucket through to versioning, lifecycle events, and everything else.
So all those things you get from CloudTrail.
Yeah. So the Lambda function I have is going to be in this event consumer folder, and all it's doing is going to log out the event. There's nothing complicated there at all. And then we get to the fun stuff, which is the EventBridge rule. So this is the rule that specifies what happens when events come in. So now that the CloudTrail from S3 has been configured, EventBridge is aware of that and is listening to all of those events. It could be hundreds of thousands of events. So what we want to say is, well, we're only interested in events where the source is from S3, and all AWS events begin with this AWS prefix. And then in the event detail envelope, which tells us a bit more about the S3 event, we want to only listen to events where it's a put object event, and it comes from this source bucket name that we've created. And then if the event matches that rule, then we send it to a target. You can have up to 5 targets. And in this case, we're just going to use 1 target, which is my Lambda function that's going to log out the event. And then, of course, there's the IAM permissions that allow EventBridge to invoke the Lambda function.
Yeah.
So all of this is good stuff to copy, because lots of when you're setting this up comes down to IAM policies and setting up CloudTrail.
Oh yeah, I like. But by the way, SAM has a nice way to get invoked when you have a Lambda that is invoked by EventBridge, that it will create the policy automatically. So that's something I really like, because before I was writing all this amount of code, I was like, but then if you use SAM and you use that notation, it just comes like really nice and clean.
It's one of those things where when I first started doing it, I kind of like to know what it's doing under the covers, so I forced myself to learn it. But now these things do it for you. A lot of the time, it's just easier to let the tool do it. But so that's the very basic one. But if I show you the next level up, because that's the one we deployed, this is the existing bucket example. So in this case, we've got an existing bucket that it's going to use, and it's all basically the same in terms of what you saw before, but it's showing you how it would bind a Lambda function to a bucket that already exists. So you'll notice it's all very, very similar. But now this one has been deployed, so the easiest thing to do is show you how it works. So that's gone out there. So deployed, first of all, if I go to EventBridge. So in EventBridge, you have this concept of an event bus, and every account has a default bus. And we're just using the default bus for this example.
And you can have multiple event buses in your own AWS account if you need so.
You can, you can. I think it's 100 as the soft limit, but if you need more, you can ask more. But
and what would be a reason to have multiple buses? Because I always use one, but why you would like to have multiple?
If you have events where you absolutely want to make sure that no one else can see them, and it's restricted to just a set of applications that can only ever see those events, that to me is the best reason for using a custom bus. Because the power of a custom bus is also the downside of the event idea, that if you put it in a custom bus, then no one else can see it. So I think most of the time you're probably going to want to use the default bus, but there are some cases where you want to have events that are just private to a set of applications or a set of accounts. And actually it's very easy. You just hit create event bus and it does it. There's nothing too complicated. But the power of this is in the rules. So in the rules that we just created, so the EventBridge example here is what we saw in that template. So if I go back to the template, I'll just make this a bit smaller. This is this rule, the source being S3, the event name is put object. And you see this over here.
Yeah.
This is what it looks like, and we've got this bucket name that it's going to be listening to. So what we can do here, I'll go to that bucket name, and I'll also go to Lambda, so we can do both at the same time. So our bucket name is going to be called JBSW Marcia S3. Yeah, we actually need to create this one because it relied on the bucket already being there. So let's create that. Okay, now it's listening to any put object event. So what we can do is I'll just grab any file from my machine.
Doc picture.
Yeah, I have an image there. So that will match because in our rule we've got the name being the same and the put object being the same. And if I go to this now,
we should see something happening.
Should. Yeah, it's new. I've not seen that before.
It's there.
So
they changed it.
Yeah. And what we can see, so we just logged out the event. If you remember from the Lambda code itself, it was nothing too crazy. It was just a log statement. But
console logged event.
Yeah, so you can see it's received the event from that put object. Now what I thought was really interesting about this is that typically when you do an S3 to Lambda connection as a native binding, you're constrained by certain types of patterns. You can only match on prefixes, suffixes, a few other things, and you cannot have overlapping prefixes and suffixes. In this, you can take anything from any part of this event and make it part of your rule. So you could match on principal ID or IP address or any number of different things. So you have a lot more power in terms of matching on specific events that you care about.
Yeah, that's something I really like from the rules, that even when you create it for your own custom application, how the event is built, it has this kind of envelope and then the payload, and it reads inside the payload of the event. So all this information, it just can be queried and filtered for, and I think it's super powerful.
Yeah, and so in the other example, which I won't deploy, but we can talk through it. This is where we use that pattern filtering a bit more complicated. So this is a multi-multi example where we have multiple buckets and multiple Lambda functions all connected together. So in this particular template, what we've got here is it's all the same stuff in terms of configuring the policies. And then CloudTrail we set up for these 3 different bucket names in this case. But then when you look at then we've got 3 Lambda functions there that would be triggered. But if we look at the rule that does all the work, it's the same thing as before. It's going to listen to an S3 source and put objects. But now it's listening to 3 different bucket names. And it's sending the events from those 3 buckets into 3 different targets. So
yeah, and I think even you could do a rule that if the prefix, if I don't know what is the name of your buckets, but imagine they're James. If all the buckets starts with James, then just whatever, right. We listen to these events. So I think that the rule matching is very flexible.
Yeah. And so the beauty of this is really that if I was building an application that's listening to events in an existing set of buckets, I don't create the bucket in my code. I make sure CloudTrail is configured for the bucket just for the types of events that I'm interested in. And I deploy my application this way, where simply I'm setting up the Lambda functions to tell event, and then EventBridge to invoke those Lambda functions based on the rule. So it's very simple. And I've written, in that same repo that I showed earlier, if I just pull this across. And again, this is on GitHub under my Twitter handle, JBESW.
I will put the link in the description box. You can do like a YouTuber like this.
Oh, okay. And what I did to show how this works is there's 2 applications that are worth checking out. One is this thing called Document Repository. It's a fairly complicated serverless application. And then there's one called Decoupled Document Repository. But what I do in there is I break up that application into an EventBridge-centric application where you have events connecting different parts of the app. And in the README, it has links to the compute blog post and other things that basically shows how it works. But essentially, this is a more complex example of how you could break up an application into 5 smaller applications this way.
That's interesting. I think people will like to look at GitHub projects to try out, because that's usually my audience is always love GitHub repos that they can clone and play with. So.
Yeah, and this is how I learned all this too, because we can talk about these things very abstractly, but ultimately it's so much easier just to clone a project and see how it works, and it's actually fairly straightforward.
And I think that's the magic in general of managed services and the cloud in general, that it's quite cheap to experiment. Even sometimes in most of the cases it's free, but even if you need to pay a little bit for experiment, it's still quite cheap, and you can turn it off and you only pay for what you use. So you try something, you say, hey, this is not for me, and then you move to the next service, but at least you can try it without really needing to buy a lot of software or installing things and getting licenses. It's just, okay, I will try this out and see if it solves my problem. If it doesn't, then I move forward and whatever. But if not, then I can keep on digging and going deep and learning.
Yeah.
And
actually, it's one of the things I say to people fairly frequently is it's worth checking out that free tier page, because it changes a lot. There's always more services being added. Yeah. So I think an EventBridge, I forget exactly what you get. I think it's 1 million events per month, but it's certainly such a number that you could play with it and it wouldn't cost you anything to see if it solves your solution. But this is a page I have bookmarked because obviously we keep adding services so frequently.
Yeah. And also one nice thing, at least of EventBridge, that keeps on changing is all the SaaS providers that are integrating with EventBridge. More and more are coming into play. So we have Auth0 that we mentioned, but then there is many more. And there is also a site where you can see all the partners there, and maybe it's something that you're already using, that you can change your webhook solution to use EventBridge.
Yeah, and if you look at many of those partners, it's very easy. You just go into your account with that partner, set up EventBridge, and then turn on the bus, basically. So it's very simple to configure. You can do it in about 60 seconds. But another thing is, if you're building a SaaS application in your business and you want to integrate with EventBridge, contact me, because I can basically help you get on the program to connect your service. It's also very easy to bring your service into EventBridge. So there's nothing particularly magic about about making it happen. It's very easy from the point of view of development, integrating with that and putting events into buses. But I can help with anybody who's interested in doing that.
That's good. That's great. I will put it in the description box, that specific text, because maybe people don't get to this end of the video, and I think this is a very important thing to say that, because I imagine a lot of SaaS providers will love to be in EventBridge and they don't know how to do it because maybe they are not as big as Auth0.
Yeah, we're interested in startups as well. So I mean, there's some huge providers there, but if you have a startup SaaS solution that you want to appear in EventBridge, there's nothing stopping you doing that. It's I think it's about a 5-day process overall. So it's fairly straightforward.
That's cool. That's great. I didn't know about that, so now I know if somebody asks where to talk to.
Yeah. I know all the EventBridge team, so I can definitely get people connected pretty easily.
That's great. So I think that's everything we have to cover today when we were thinking about EventBridge and these event-driven architectures. And I hope it helps a lot of people to hear what you can do with these technologies and how to solve these problems in big enterprise, but as well, I think in smaller startups when they want to start with the right foot and not building a huge monolith.
Yeah. I think it can be helpful to lots of different developers, and as a pattern, it's another tool in our toolkit for building applications that are agile and easy to maintain. So yeah. I'm a huge fan of EventBridge. I think it can help a lot of people.
Exactly. And where people can find you besides GitHub?
So I'm on Twitter. My handle is JBESW, just like my name. You can also email me at Amazon, just my name, jbezic@amazon.com. And I'm on LinkedIn and Slack and lots of other systems. But any way you try to contact me, I will respond. So whichever you prefer, email, Twitter usually is the best.
Good. So I will put all the links in the description box so people can go and talk to you. And if you have anything else to say, or we're done.
No, thanks ever so much for having me, Marcia. It's been great chatting to you.
It's always fun to have you in this channel. So thank you very much for accepting my invitation, and I hope you have a great day.
You too. Thanks very much.
Bye. This was the video for today. I hope you like it. If you did, give a big thumbs up. And if you want to read James or see any of the links that we mentioned during this session, they're all in the description box, so go and check them out. In the comments, if you can leave me who you would like me to interview, who you would like me to talk about, which topics you would like me to cover in this series. I would love to know what you're thinking, and I have a poll going on always in my community tab where I will tell you who is coming to the episode next and who I'm interviewing, so you can ask questions that I can pass them to them. So go and check that. And if you like this video, please give a big thumbs up. That always helps me to grow and share it. So I see you in the next episode of FooBar. Ciao, ciao!